On November 5th, Americans went to the polls to vote for their next president. In the lead-up to the elections, updates and commentary from the campaign trail dominated global news cycles. For American voters, there certainly was a lot to ponder. For us in Asia, conversations have been more about which candidate would be better for us. Now that we've had time to digest the results and have gotten past first reaction opinions, let's really ask, what does a second Trump presidency mean for Asia in the context of trade relations, the markets, and geopolitical stability? President-elect Donald Trump, as he assembled his cabinet, might have already given us some insight into what his priorities will be. Let's talk. I'm Claressa Monteiro. This is Lens on Singapore, a podcast from the Business Times. Joining me in the studio this afternoon, Geoff Howie, Singapore Exchange's market strategist, and Dr Joseph Liow, Dean, College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, NTU. Geoff, just like old times, huh? Just so you know, Joseph, Geoff and I used to host a weekly market wrap on radio for years. So we might have to contain him.
I'll leave that to you.
Now, okay, before we get into our deep dive, let me ask you both this. Was this the outcome you expected?
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at it first. The outcome is one thing, but really what was perhaps surprising was the victory, how decisive it was. In the build-up to the election, people were discussing about how we probably have to wait a few days, maybe even a week
Everyone
or
was
so.
expecting it. Even the media was camping out, expecting it to be days.
Exactly. And then we basically got the results like that.
Right. Geoff?
Yeah, I think it was in June. I thought there would be a lot of parallels to 1968 when Lyndon Johnson did not choose to run for a second term. And also you had that assassination on RFK and you had the Republicans basically win that election. Now, on a serious side, I do think the longer that campaign went on, the better Kamala Harris had a chance in actually possibly winning the election.
The first Trump presidency was marked by an America First policy. That really did reshape US-Asia relations. So where do you see US-Asia relations headed in the coming years?
Well, I think a lot of the pattern or the trend lines, if I may, was set in the first Trump administration, right? Because when
You think he's going to double down?
I think he will double down on the tariffs. He's made that quite clear, and it's quite drastic what he's suggesting that he would do. And even if he does half of what he said he's going to do, that's going to be very significant for China, for the rest of the region. If we consider what the Trump administration did, Trump 1.0, there was some progress in terms of security engagement and security commitments to the region, albeit his preference is to work bilaterally with countries rather than sort of multilaterally or regionally. So an organization like ASEAN, for example, they'll be wringing their hands about how relevant they're going to be, or irrelevant, as it were. There are a few things we know about Trump and his style, right? It's going to be very personal. Connecting with him is going to be important. But having said that, we also need to recognize that Trump is someone who lives very comfortably with contradictions. So he can be best buddies with Xi Jinping and at the same time slap 1.5 tons of tariffs on China, and he'll go to bed at night. No issue with that.
Okay, Geoff, I want to throw a different nuance on it for you. Markets immediately after the elections were called. The US markets just surged. Short term, or do you think this is a signal of a market shift? Is this going to last for a while?
Yeah, how sustainable that is will depend on the delivery. So there's 3 core economic policies I think that this new Trump administration will bring in. The first is obviously trade and tariffs, as we spoke. Universal tariffs, specific tariffs. You've also got the taxes, potential cutting the corporate tax rate down from 21% to 15%. That has obviously buoyed the stock market, but also the regulatory cuts that could be coming as well, particularly in finance and energy sectors, health sector maybe. It just basically means you have more return and more output but at the same time, you've got more risk.
Okay, so you're saying it depends. Now, the SDI also surged, taking a cue from US markets, a bull run under Trump. Is that what, from your sensing, investors are hoping for, are looking for?
I think that's more to do with growth, Claressa. It's really the outlook for growth that is obviously one part of that rally in the US stock market. It's not just stocks repricing because the here and now valuations say there's more froth in the market, but it really comes down to growth. That's what's also coincided with us in Singapore. We've also seen a recovery in global trade, a recovery in regional manufacturing and electronics. So that's added extra legs to our market. And, the case in point is we're now within 5% of that all-time high in October 2007. And the very day before that high was made, Singapore's third quarter GDP growth was reported to be up 9.4% year on year, which is really strong. So again, much hinges on growth. And from looking at the policy perspectives from the US, whether it's tariffs, the corporate tax rate cuts and the impact of regulation, much of the impact on the market will be coming through the lens of what is the impact on growth.
Let's get to US-Asia, specifically US-China relations. How is that going to impact us if tensions ratchet up? But I found it very interesting that in his congratulatory message to Trump, Xi Jinping urged both countries to find a right way to get along. What does that signal?
I think as far as China is concerned, they didn't have a preference because they knew the trajectory was such, right?
Right.
Regardless of who came into the White House. You've got a situation where you know that it's a president who is transactional, who's very keen and has no qualms to assert himself and his authority into the discussions with the Chinese. But on the other hand, there is that unpredictability and that penchant for disruption, and the Chinese like predictability.
They're also quite transactional, though.
Transactional in the context of predictability, that's the best. Yeah. So they've got one with him, but not quite the other. So they'll have to manage that.
Both of you mentioned tariffs within the first 30 seconds of you starting to speak. If he does put in all these additional trade tariffs with China, with Asia, what's that going to do for investor sentiment?
If your tariffs are going to be 10% universal tariffs, there's a lot of modelling that's gone on there that suggests that inflation in the US could increase to 1%.
Which is not so good for the US.
Not when your core PCE is levelling out at 2.5%. So it does mean that your outlook for interest rate cuts next year is less dovish outlook than it was a few months ago. In fact, I think we're looking at around 75 basis points less of rate cuts to be delivered next year.
I will contend that there's a very real possibility Trump won because the voters believed he would be able to bring down inflation. It's very difficult to think about protecting democracy when you're worried about putting eggs on the table. What do you think, Joseph?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's quite clear that the economy and specifically rising cost of living was a major issue for voters. And what we had was a situation where on the Democrat side, the party that has traditionally been advocating for unions and labor, if I may, they lost the plot, right? You saw them pivot to an agenda that was very much focused on progressive social dynamics, right? Whereas people were struggling with cost of living issues and were very open to a candidate who was prepared to tell them, look, I'll solve the issues for you and this is how I'm going to do it.
So inflation is, though, a real concern. I think for us, the question is, are some of the things that Trump is talking about implementing in the US going to impact inflation here in Singapore?
Yeah, well, the transmission mechanism for that would be the US dollar. So when the US dollar is stronger, the Southeast Asian markets do struggle because obviously a stronger US dollar attracts money back to the US dollar. It can debase some of the return on investment that you have here and just has that negative currency translation impact. That's from an overall broad inflation perspective. But if the tariffs and the policy is strategically looking at reducing costs of living for American workers, American families, then their goal would not be to inflict inflation across the world, but rather to put more costs on the rest of the world that we carry. So that
We don't want those extra costs. Thanks very much.
And how much can our producers and our value chains absorb that? So that's the question.
Just to add on to what Geoff was talking about, I think there's another dimension for the region, right? If you're looking at a US government that is going to be very heavily focused on the domestic situation, who takes a transactional approach to American commitments, the reality is there are a number of commitments that the Americans already have out there that are costing a lot of money and driving, to some extent, inflation as well in the United States. And if the solution to the economic problems is to pull back, as Trump has suggested that the United States will do, regardless of whether someone else steps in to foot the bill, on Ukraine, on Israel, whatever, where the US is saying that we're not going to do it anymore. That's going to have significant consequences for not just our region, but globally as well, right?
Sure. You're talking about security commitments.
Yeah, security commitments. The US, rightly or wrongly, for good or bad, has incurred this reputation of contributing to a mess and then leaving. And then someone else has to clean up the mess, right?
I think that just the question of national security, global security, in some of these changes that he's proposing is a whole different podcast because it's such a big question that you can't just cover in a few minutes. There are so many elements to it. Now I want to do that podcast
We'll
too.
come back
No,
for
you
this
come back.
other
Yeah, you.
podcast.
But for now, I want to actually change tact and look at something else that has been actually a question that has been brewing in my mind simply because I am a mother of young adults who may be thinking, okay, is there better opportunity out of Singapore for them? With some of the immigration policies that Trump is talking about imposing, could it make the US less enticing to our young, bright Asians who might then decide, okay, maybe not the US, maybe Singapore?
Maybe I'll say something about that since it's my industry, higher ed. Certainly for us in Singapore, that's an opportunity. But having said that, the flip side is that the universities in the United States, in terms of being at the forefront of new knowledge, right? Whether in the STEM technology fields or even in the non-STEM fields, I think no one can really hold a candle next to them, even now.
Now, we've had a great conversation. I only have time for one more question, and hindsight is 2020. The Democrats as a party are now asking themselves the question, what went wrong? I think for us, I'd like to turn the focus back to Singapore and ask if there are lessons for us to learn here, given the fact that it isn't that far ahead for us that we'll be looking at a general election.
Well, I think one obvious one is, the economics of elections, right? At the end of the day, people are concerned about the prices of items on the shelf at, fair price, or sheng xiong. Paying attention to that, I think it's quite critical. The second thing that we can pick up from this election is perhaps the reality that there are pockets of constituents who may not be as vocal, but circumstances and the noise around them really starts to shape their thinking and their votes. So if you remember the 2016 election, one thing that pollsters missed out was white American males who were not college educated. Right. This time round, Trump was devastatingly successful in tapping into that young vote base, people who were captivated by his ideas about innovation and the potential, the whole Elon Musk effect.
But how do you get them then? If they're not talking about it, you
No, you
can't
gotta
be
work the ground.
eavesdropping at the coffee shop every day to
You
get
gotta
what
work
they're
the ground.
thinking.
Yeah.
Geoff, you're not Singaporean, but you've lived here a very, very long time.
15 years. Yeah. And I would say the take home was the fact that the majority of Americans did not want handouts, they wanted jobs. And I think this is
I
something...
think that's pretty universal.
Yeah, and that's something we do well here. We take the upskilling processes really seriously and purposeful employment. And I think as long as we keep that the focus, then
Jobs.
it's what it's got to be.
Yep, we all want to work.
And being more productive and targeting the right sectors and the right industries for the next 10 years and making sure we're aligned. Even the money Singtel spends on training its staff on AI, for instance, is quite significant. This is, upskilling is, I think, the real policy measure that we really have to take on board, and we do.
That's a great and positive note to leave it on. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Geoff. It's been an intriguing conversation. And while it might still be too early to tell if a second term under President-elect Donald Trump would mean significant challenges for the region, as an eternal optimist, I will contend that change isn't always bad. And as an Asian, I also am quite practical. So this is where I'm coming from. Singapore is an important partner to the US. We also have a good relationship with China. So perhaps there is a real opportunity for Singapore in the coming years to be a bridge between the US and China. Throw your mind back to the role we played in President Trump's meeting with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. I'll leave you with that thought. I'm Claressa Monteiro. This was Lens on Singapore. Thank you for listening.